Welcome to the Anh English. Jackson Stone was not an ordinary man. He was an adventurer, a traveler, and a seeker of hidden treasures. He loved exploring new places, solving ancient mysteries, and discovering secrets lost in time. People around the world knew his name because of his exciting journeys. One morning, while drinking his favorite cup of coffee, Jackson received a letter. It was an old yellow envelope with no sender's name. Curious, he opened it. Inside there was a short message written in neat handwriting. Jackson, I have found something incredible, a hidden temple deep in the jungle. They say a valuable treasure is inside. Come quickly, I will meet you there. Ben. Jackson's heart started to race. A hidden temple? A valuable treasure? This was exactly the kind of adventure he loved. He immediately started packing his bag. He grabbed his compass, flashlight, rope, and notebook. He also packed food and water because he didn't know how long the journey would take. As he got ready, he thought about his friend Ben. They had traveled together many times before, searching for lost treasures. If Ben said this was important, it must be something big. Jackson took one last look at the letter, smiled, and whispered to himself, "Let's go find some treasure." He left his small apartment and headed to the airport. His destination? A remote jungle, far away from the city. This was not going to be an easy trip, but Jackson loved challenges. The excitement of the unknown made his heart beat faster. Would he find the hidden temple? Would he discover the treasure inside? Or would there be dangers waiting for him? This was just the beginning of an unforgettable adventure. It was a quiet morning. The sun shone brightly, and the birds chirped outside Jackson Stone's window. He sat at his wooden desk, sipping a warm cup of coffee, enjoying the peaceful moment. His apartment was small but filled with books, maps, and souvenirs from past adventures. It was a place of memories, a place of stories waiting to be told. As he lifted his cup for another sip, a soft thud broke the silence. A letter had been slipped through the mail slot. Jackson wasn't expecting any mail. Curious, he walked over and picked up the envelope. It felt old, the paper slightly rough under his fingers. There was no return address, only his name written neatly across the front, Jackson Stone. A strange feeling crept over him. Who had sent this? He quickly tore the envelope open and unfolded the paper inside. The message was short but urgent. Jackson, I have found something incredible, a hidden temple deep in the jungle. They say a valuable treasure is inside. Come quickly, I will meet you there. Ben. He read the letter twice, then a third time. His heart pounded with excitement. A hidden temple, a treasure, and Ben, his old friend, his partner in adventure. They had explored together many times, searching for lost artifacts and ancient secrets. It had been months since he last heard from him. Why now? Why this letter? Jackson leaned back in his chair, staring at the letter. It gave no details, no map, no location, just the words, "deep in the jungle." But which jungle? There were thousands around the world, and yet something inside him told him this was real. If Ben had sent this message, it had to mean something. There was no time to waste. He needed to prepare. Years of adventure had taught him that a journey like this required careful planning. He reached for his notebook and made a list. Compass, flashlight, rope, first aid kit, notebook, pen, extra clothes, food, water. Jackson moved quickly, grabbing his trusted brown leather backpack and packing his essentials. He always traveled light, taking only what was necessary. His heart raced with anticipation. It had been too long since his last adventure. Before leaving, he held up the letter once more, studying it carefully. Something felt off. He turned it over, looking for anything unusual. At first, nothing. But as he held it up to the light, a faint watermark appeared the shape of a tree. His eyes narrowed. A clue. This was no ordinary letter. Ben had left him a message, hidden in plain sight. Jackson felt the familiar rush of excitement. The mystery had already begun. He slung his backpack over his shoulder, grabbed his brown explorer's hat, and stepped out the door. A new adventure was calling, and he was ready. The airport was busy and filled with the sound of rolling suitcases, announcements, and people chatting. Jackson Stone moved quickly through the crowd, his backpack securely strapped to his shoulders. He had booked the earliest flight he could find to the nearest city near the jungle. His heart raced with excitement. He didn't know exactly what he would find, but he was ready for the challenge. After a long flight, Jackson finally arrived at a small, hot, and humid airport. The air smelled of earth and rain, and the sound of distant birds filled the air. He stepped outside and looked around. The jungle was not far. Lush green trees stretched endlessly into the horizon. He could feel the adventure ahead. A man was waiting for him at the exit. He was short, with dark skin and sharp eyes. He wore a wide-brimmed hat and a loose shirt. "You Jackson Stone?" the man asked in a deep voice. "That's me," Jackson said, shaking the man's hand. "I'm Marco. Ben told me you'd come. I'll take you as far as the river. From there, you're on your own." Jackson nodded. He was used to working alone. They climbed into an old dusty Jeep. The engine roared to life, and they sped down a narrow dirt road. The deeper they drove into the jungle, the rougher the road became. Jackson held onto the side of the Jeep as it bounced over rocks and holes. The heat was thick, and sweat dripped down his face. After nearly an hour, the Jeep stopped at the edge of a wide, slow-moving river. The water was brown, and the thick jungle surrounded it on both sides. A small wooden boat was tied to a tree nearby. "This is where I leave you," Marco said, stepping out of the Jeep. Jackson grabbed his backpack and climbed into the boat. "Be careful," Marco warned. "The jungle is full of surprises." Jackson smiled. "That's what makes it fun." With that, he pushed off and let the current take him forward. The jungle was alive. Birds called from the trees, and monkeys jumped from branch to branch. Strange insects buzzed in the humid air. Jackson paddled slowly, keeping his eyes on the thick trees ahead. Somewhere in this jungle, Ben was waiting. Somewhere in this jungle, a hidden temple stood untouched for centuries. Hours passed, and the river narrowed. The trees grew closer, their roots twisting into the water. The air smelled of damp leaves and rich soil. Jackson checked his map. He was getting closer. Then, something moved in the water. A shadow slid just beneath the surface. Jackson froze. Crocodile? Snake? Suddenly, the water exploded. A large crocodile lunged toward the boat, its jaws wide open. Jackson barely had time to react. He grabbed his paddle and slammed it against the crocodile's snout. The creature growled and disappeared back into the murky water. Jackson took a deep breath. His heart was pounding. "Okay," he muttered. "That was close." He paddled faster, eager to get out of the water. Soon, he reached the riverbank. He pulled the boat onto the shore and looked around. The jungle stretched endlessly before him, thick and mysterious. He adjusted his backpack and took his first step into the unknown. Every step was slow and careful. The jungle floor was covered in roots and fallen leaves. Strange sounds echoed through the trees, a distant howl, the rustling of leaves, the snap of a branch. Jackson moved forward, cutting through vines with his machete. His boots sank slightly into the damp ground. The deeper he went, the darker it became. The thick canopy above blocked out the sun, creating a shadowy world beneath. Then something caught his eye, a marking on a tree. It was carved deep into the bark, a symbol of a tree, just like the one on the letter. Jackson's pulse quickened. He was on the right path. The adventure had truly begun. The jungle was thick, and every step Jackson took felt heavier. The air was humid, and the sounds of insects filled his ears. He wiped the sweat from his forehead and pushed forward. He knew he was getting close. The tree symbol he had found earlier matched the one on the letter. It had to mean something. As he walked deeper into the jungle, the ground started to change. The soft earth turned into stone pathways, cracked and covered in moss. Jackson stopped. This wasn't natural. Someone had built this a long time ago. He looked around and saw something hidden beneath the vines, a tall stone pillar with strange carvings. Jackson moved closer and brushed the vines away. The carvings showed figures wearing ancient robes, holding objects that looked like treasures. His heart raced. He had found something important. He followed the stone path, stepping carefully. The jungle had almost swallowed it, but it was still there, leading him forward. Then, through the trees, he saw it. An ancient temple. It was massive, made of dark stone, standing in the middle of the jungle like a forgotten secret. The walls were covered in carvings, telling stories of a time long past. Vines crawled up the sides and trees had grown around it, but the structure was still strong. Jackson took a deep breath and stepped closer. He reached out and touched the cool stone. This temple had been here for centuries, untouched by modern hands. A sense of awe filled him. Then something moved. Jackson froze. A monkey ran across the steps of the temple, disappearing into the shadows. He let out a breath and smiled. Just a monkey, he whispered. But he knew there could be more dangers ahead. He walked up the ancient steps, careful not to disturb anything. At the entrance, there were two large stone doors, slightly open. Darkness waited inside. Jackson took out his flashlight and shined it into the temple. The beam of light revealed a long hallway filled with dust and cobwebs. The air smelled old, like time had stopped inside. He stepped forward, his boots echoing in the silence. The walls were covered in symbols and ancient writing. Jackson pulled out his notebook and sketched a few markings. He wished Ben was here. Ben was good at reading old scripts. As he walked deeper inside, the air became cooler. Then he saw something on the ground, a footprint in the dust. His breath caught. Someone had been here. Was it Ben, or was someone else searching for the treasure? Jackson tightened his grip on his flashlight and moved forward. The adventure was only beginning. Jackson moved carefully through the dark hallway. His footsteps echoed on the cold stone floor. The air was thick with dust, and cobwebs hung from the ceiling. He could feel the weight of time in this place. This temple had been hidden for centuries, untouched by the modern world. As he walked deeper inside, the passageway suddenly opened into a large chamber. The walls were covered in ancient carvings, and strange symbols were painted on the ceiling. In the middle of the room, there was a stone pedestal. Jackson stepped closer and saw a small, worn piece of parchment lying on top. He picked it up carefully and held it under his flashlight. The writing was old, but still clear. 2 paths lie ahead. One leads to the treasure, the other leads to danger. Choose wisely. Jackson felt a chill run down his spine. This was a test. Whoever built this temple wanted to make sure only the right person could find the treasure. He turned and looked around the chamber. At the far end, 2 doorways stood side by side. Both were dark. Both looked exactly the same. He took a step closer, trying to see if there were any clues. The left path had old footprints in the dust, but they stopped suddenly, as if someone had never come back. The right path was clean, untouched, as if no one had walked there in years. Jackson hesitated. The words on the parchment repeated in his mind. Choose wisely. He took a deep breath and closed his eyes for a moment. He had always trusted his instincts, and they had never failed him before. He listened carefully. There was a faint sound coming from the left passage, a slow dripping noise like water hitting stone. But the right passage was completely silent. He looked back at the footprints. Something felt wrong. Why did they stop so suddenly? Jackson's heart pounded. He had to make a choice. Finally, he stepped forward. He chose the right path. As he crossed the threshold, the air around him felt different, cooler, lighter. He turned back for a moment and saw the left passage suddenly collapse, sealing off the entrance with heavy stones. His eyes widened. He had made the right choice. Taking a deep breath, Jackson adjusted his backpack and continued forward. The treasure was getting closer. Jackson stepped carefully into the dark passage. The walls were rough and the air smelled damp. His flashlight flickered as he moved forward. The silence was heavy, broken only by the soft sound of his boots against the stone floor. He knew this temple was old, and old places often had secrets and traps. He walked slowly, scanning the walls for any strange markings. His instincts told him to be careful. Ancient builders always designed traps to protect their treasures. He had seen it before in other ruins. Suddenly, his foot hit something. A small click echoed through the passage. Jackson froze. For a moment, nothing happened. Then whoosh! Arrows shot from the walls, flying past him at lightning speed. He jumped to the side, pressing his back against the cold stone. The arrows missed him by inches, striking the opposite wall with a sharp thunk. Jackson exhaled. That was close. He took a step forward, this time more carefully. His eyes searched the floor for hidden pressure plates. He needed to be extra cautious. The passage continued deeper into the temple, leading to a narrow bridge over a deep pit. Jackson shined his flashlight down and saw sharp spikes at the bottom. No room for mistakes, he whispered. He placed one foot on the bridge. It felt solid. Slowly, he moved forward, testing each step. He was halfway across when he heard a low rumbling sound. The bridge started shaking. Jackson's heart pounded. He had to move fast. The stones beneath his feet were falling away, disappearing into the darkness below. Jackson ran. His muscles tensed as he leaped toward the other side. His fingers just caught the edge of the platform and he dangled above the spikes. For a second, he couldn't breathe. With all his strength, he pulled himself up and rolled onto solid ground. His arms ached, but he was safe. Jackson lay on his back, staring at the ceiling, catching his breath. Then he heard something, a deep, mechanical grinding noise. He turned his head and saw the walls moving. They were closing in. Jackson scrambled to his feet. He needed to find a way out fast. He looked around. There, a small opening in the far wall. He sprinted toward it, dodging falling rocks as the temple rumbled around him. He reached the opening and dived through just in time. Silence. Jackson lay on the ground, breathing hard. The walls behind him had sealed shut. There was no turning back now. He pulled himself up and dusted off his jacket. His flashlight beam moved across the room, and then he saw it, a golden statue shining in the darkness. The treasure was near. Jackson stood up slowly, his breath still heavy from the close escape. His flashlight flickered as he pointed it toward the golden statue in the center of the room. It stood on a tall stone pedestal, covered in dust but still shining in the dim light. He stepped forward, his boots crunching on the ancient floor. The room was quiet, too quiet. He had been in enough temples to know that finding the treasure was never the end of the journey. Jackson moved closer, his heart pounding. The golden statue was small but beautifully detailed, shaped like a figure holding a jewel in its hands. The craftsmanship was incredible. He reached out carefully and brushed off the dust. The metal felt cool and smooth under his fingertips. For a moment, he just stared. He had traveled through thick jungles, crossed dangerous rivers, dodged traps, and almost lost his life to get here. And now, he was standing in front of the lost treasure. A slow smile spread across his face. "I finally found it," he whispered. But his moment of victory didn't last long. As soon as he lifted the statue from the pedestal, a deep rumbling filled the room. Jackson froze, then crack. The floor beneath him began to shake. Dust fell from the ceiling. Stones shifted. He didn't wait to see what would happen next. He grabbed the statue tightly and spun around, searching for a way out. The walls were starting to close in, and cracks appeared on the floor. He knew this temple was designed to collapse once the treasure was taken. He ran. The ground beneath him trembled as large rocks began to fall from the ceiling. He dodged one, then another, moving as fast as his legs would carry him. Then he saw it, an exit, a narrow passage at the far end of the room. Jackson pushed himself forward, leaping over broken stones. He could hear water rushing somewhere below, like an underground river. If the temple collapsed, it would be buried forever. He sprinted toward the passage, but just as he reached the entrance, the floor gave way beneath him. For a second, he felt nothing but air. Then he was falling. His arms flailed, trying to grab something, anything. His fingers caught the edge of a stone ledge. He gripped it tightly, his legs dangling above the darkness below. His heart pounded. With all his strength, he pulled himself up, his muscles screaming in protest. He swung a leg over the ledge and rolled onto solid ground. He took a deep breath and looked down at the treasure in his hands. Covered in dust, but still glowing in the dim light, the golden statue was safe. But Jackson wasn't safe yet. The temple was still collapsing around him. Holding the treasure tightly, he got back on his feet. The adventure wasn't over, not yet. Jackson knew he had to move fast. The temple was falling apart around him. The ground shook beneath his feet, and large cracks spread across the walls. Dust filled the air, making it hard to see. He coughed and tightened his grip on the golden statue. A loud rumbling sound echoed through the temple. Stones started falling from the ceiling. Jackson dodged left, then jumped forward as a huge rock crashed where he had just been standing. His heart pounded. He had to find a way out now. He turned his flashlight toward the passage ahead. The exit had to be close. He ran forward, leaping over fallen stones and broken pillars. Then he heard something water. Somewhere below, water was rushing in. The temple wasn't just collapsing, it was flooding. Jackson picked up speed. Every second counted. Suddenly, the ground beneath him gave way. He lost his balance and fell straight into a deep, dark tunnel. Cold water rushed over him. He gasped for air as he surfaced. The tunnel was filling fast, and the current was pulling him forward. He kicked hard, trying to stay above the water. He still had the golden statue in one hand. He couldn't lose it now. Ahead, he saw a small light. It was the end of the tunnel. Jackson swam with all his strength, the water pushing him forward. Rocks continued to fall behind him, splashing into the rising flood. With one final effort, he reached the tunnel's end and grabbed onto a thick vine hanging from the ceiling. He pulled himself up, climbing higher as the water rose beneath him. His muscles burned, but he refused to let go. Finally, he reached a narrow opening in the temple wall. With one last push, he squeezed through and tumbled onto the jungle floor. The moment he landed, he rolled onto his back, breathing hard. The temple behind him collapsed completely, sending a cloud of dust into the air. For a long moment, he just lay there, staring at the sky. Then, he looked at the golden statue in his hand. It was still there. He had done it. Jackson smiled. He was alive. He had escaped. And his adventure was far from over. Jackson sat on a large rock at the edge of the jungle, catching his breath. The sun was rising, painting the sky in soft shades of orange and pink. The temple was gone, buried under stone and time, but in his hands he still held the golden statue. He turned it over, studying its fine details. The ancient figure carved into the gold looked wise, almost as if it had been waiting to be found. This was more than just a treasure. It was a piece of history, a story from the past that had survived for centuries. He thought about everything he had been through. The dangerous journey through the jungle, the mysterious letter, the traps inside the temple, and the final escape through the flooding tunnel. It had been one of the toughest adventures of his life. But it had also been one of the most exciting. Jackson knew he had a choice. He could keep the statue for himself, or he could do what was right. He had always believed that true treasure belonged to the world, not to one person. He smiled to himself. He already knew what he was going to do. A few days later, Jackson stood inside a grand museum, watching as the golden statue was placed in a glass case. People gathered around taking pictures, reading about its history and admiring its beauty. He felt proud, not because he had found the treasure, but because he had protected its story. As he walked out of the museum, he felt something in his pocket. He reached inside and pulled out the old letter from Ben, the letter that had started it all. He chuckled and whispered, "I wonder where the next adventure will take me." Because for Jackson Stone, the greatest treasure was never gold, it was the journey. Thank you for learning with the English.